Now, I've been here long enough, but I now come to the most important, in a way, this poetry is all around us. And it's important, and we've spoken in many voices, but now we come to wisdom, and we come to our main speaker, and it is my enormous pleasure to introduce to you AKEEL BILGRAMI, who Ho Shang has invited to deliver the second WHABIZ Memorial Lecture in honor of his sister, about whom you heard in a poem. Okay, so this is the person, the woman of great wit, spirit, and wisdom, but tremendous imagination and spirit, and she is the one in honor of whom these lectures are being held.
My mother would have been 100 years old this year. She was a product of Gandhi's revolution in women's education. Her teachers were Maharishi Karve and Kapilaben Khandwala, who later was awarded the Lenin Prize. My mother wished to teach sociology in a college. Her daughter WHABIZ, my sister, fulfilled this dream of our mother. WHABIZ understood history. She understood British history, which she studied, as well as Gandhi's revolt against it. Her first trip abroad was to Budapest and her last to Prague during the Soviet era. In between, she read all of history and traveled all over Europe for 20 years. She studied both in India and America and worked in both places. She studied the Todas of the Nilgiris and taught sociology in a black Midwestern college. She left her wealth to this college to fund scholarships for black and Chicana women. Her interests besides books and travel were homemaking, cooking, gardening, and a Michigan Kuhn cat whom I hated. She wrote on our childhood, her Mexican gardener, and on the Todas. From the modest amount she left me, I have started this lecture series to celebrate and continue my sister's work cut short by early death. These lectures are designed by Rukmini to bring home Indian scholars working abroad mainly, but also intend to include world poets and third world women and gay activists. Welcome to the second lecture in the series. The first one in Delhi on art and insecurity was by Homi Bhabha. He was stimulating, and I hope you will find AKEEL on Gandhi&Marx equally profound and accessible. Thank you for coming.
I think today's choice of AKEEL is a really, really inspired choice. And now this is not only because AKEEL is one of India's most luminous scholars, a fact which we will have occasion to appreciate in a few moments when I read you a few, and only a few, of the details of his distinguished career. It is also not because AKEEL shares with Professor Homi Bhabha of Harvard, who delivered the first WHABIZ Memorial Lecture, a stellar reputation both in the West and in India. I think that there's actually something else even more magical that is particular to this occasion. This quality of enchantment, and AKEEL will recognize the word enchantment because it's in the title of one of his books. He comes, I believe, from the fact that it is this amazing city of Hyderabad which is home to AKEEL, as it is to Ho Shang, or has been to Ho Shang. And this is a unique reason why I think this city, and indeed all of us today, can take a special pride in having AKEEL with us. And now, AKEEL sent me a bio, and I must say that it was such an impressive bio that I've done some cutting. But you can go on the internet afterwards. But anyway, what makes AKEEL so special? He's a Hyderabad native. He is Sidney Morgenbesser, Chair of Philosophy at Columbia University. He's Director of pardon me for reading this, because this is all quite complex. Director of the South Asian Institute at Columbia, and professor of Columbia's Committee on Global Thought. And of course, when he speaks to us about Gandhi today, we will learn more about how Professor BILGRAMI fills out the notion of global thought for us. AKEEL did a first degree in English literature from Elphinstone College and then went as a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford, where he studied politics, philosophy, and economics. And I remember reading recently a charming comment, I think it was by Professor BILGRAMI himself, who says that, we've had all this poetry and all that, and what he said is that, he moved from English literature to doing philosophy because he found English literature just too hard. I thought that was very charming. I hope you did say it, AKEEL. Anyway, so that's what he said. And anyway, but he went on to do, this poor student of literature, went on to do a degree in a PhD from Cornell University, which is one of the strongest schools in the US. He has then authored many books on fundamental areas of philosophy, such as Belief and Meaning, Self-Knowledge and Resentment, but also more historically grounded works like Secularism, Identity, and Enchantment, all published by gilt-edged presses. I don't mean G-U-I-L-T, presses like Harvard University and Blackwell and so on. And in addition, like Hoshang, AKEEL is a dedicated teacher. He teaches courses in philosophy of mind and language, politics, and rationality. He is the director of the Heyman Center, and he was elected to be a fellow, a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library, which would mean, at least to me it means, that he is a real champion of the pleasures of reading, which I think we'd all agree today in these days of cut and paste is very welcome in these days of instant knowledge and gratification. And that is not all. Finally, let me say, AKEEL is editor and president of the trustees of the Journal of Philosophy, which has been Columbia's leading journal for about 100 years. So he is recipient of several prestigious fellowships, and in India he has held the Radhakrishnan Chair. He lives with his wife and daughter in New York City, and which one of us would not like that as well? And at the end, I think you will all agree with me that there is no shortage of reasons, practical, and he's doing a book, practical as well as pleasurable, that will easily persuade us to listen to AKEEL over the next hour. Listen raptly. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor AKEEL BILGRAMI.
I'm going to speak about Gandhi and Marx. I've put Marx in parentheses partly because it will primarily be on Gandhi. My daughter, when she saw this poster and saw the parenthesis around Marx, she says, "What does that mean? Does it mean you're going to be speaking about Groucho?" Well, I'm going to speak about Gandhi and Marx because despite what a lot of people constantly say, which is that there's a great difference in their thinking, which I think should be just acknowledged, and I'm going to take it for granted because it's very widely studied and known, I'm going to seek affinities between them. And the affinities between great thinkers is not worn on the sleeves of texts. You really have to construct a framework so that they come into view. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to begin and end by presenting a framework in which, despite the many differences, some remarkable saliences and agreements come together in Gandhi and Marx, but the framework will be mine, and that's inevitable because you can't just expect these affinities to be on view in text themselves. In order to construct the framework, I'm going to step back and ask you to remember something very basic about the history of the West, of Europe, and the political thinking that came out of it. Every school child knows that during the great events that transformed Europe in the late 18th century, there was a slogan in which two ideals were articulated, and these two ideals have become the cornerstone of what has come to be known as liberal thought. And these are the ideals of liberty and equality. These are widely admired, and they are central to our political frameworks in which we live and which we cherish. But if you step back, you'll notice something very obvious that is occasionally remarked on, but nothing really deep has been made of it. And that is that it, in a bizarre development, as soon as these two ideals were articulated, they were theoretically and methodologically developed so that they were in irresoluble tension with one another. Now, this is a very strange thing for a world outlook on public life and politics to do, to articulate two ideals and then right away develop them so that they are never going to be jointly implementable. That they're almost in a zero-sum tension with one another, such that if you increase the one, you're bound to have to decrease the other. The Cold War is just the most crude and spectacular version of this, with one side claiming to present liberty, with the other side damning it for doing it at the cost of equality, and vice versa. That's just a very crude and very late manifestation of the tension I mean. The tension was there in much more sophisticated, theoretical work for 200 years before the Cold War. So that's something that is very strange for any two ideals to be the central concepts in a whole way of thinking, but at odds with one another. I'm going to mention two features that about liberty that puts them in tension with equality, just to give you a completely familiar sense of why they are in tension. The first is very well known, so I'll just mention it and move on, and that is that the possession of property bestows a liberty upon you, and that liberty is enshrined in the law of the land, and it's very widely known how that gives rise to inequalities. There's no reason for me to say much more about it. Marx was only its most powerful critic, but there have been critics of it for the 300 years since it became established as the kind of institution that liberalism fusing liberty and property together. The second feature is much more unusual and interesting, and it's in a way deeper because it's psychologically the source of inequalities, material inequalities. And I don't know what to call it, but a phrase that comes to my mind is the incentivization of talent. This is a very deep part of Western thought, beginning in Europe in the 17th century, that individual talent must be allowed to reap praise and reward. That is, it is a person's individual right that if she possesses talent, or he possesses talent, she or he should be allowed to reap the rewards of that talent. This is absolutely central to our way of thinking. And the idea is that if you could not praise individuals and allow them to reap the rewards of it, who are you going to praise? You'd have to praise the zeitgeist. But that would be to deny the individual a place and see the individual as merely a physical embodiment of the zeitgeist. But that is precisely to deny the individual the liberty to enjoy the fruits of his or her talent. And in fact, the right goes to others too, because others have the right to enjoy the productions of the talent of an individual. So if Sachin Tendulkar has a lot of talent, then others have the right to enjoy the productions of his talent because they're incentivized to be as excellent as they can be. That's the culture in which the political culture. It's not just culture, it's the political culture in which we live. And it's, by political culture, I mean the concept of desert is now understood in terms of a right that individuals have. It would be considered a hysterical egalitarian ideologue's artifice to say that this is a bad thing because it leads to inequalities. And you can just multiply the examples. Merit raises, endorsements for sportsmen, bonuses on Wall Street. You remember that when there was a financial crisis, people said, well, these people are getting millions as bonuses. We should cut these bonuses. And the response of the banks, investment banks, was, you will deprive us of our talent if you don't allow us to give these huge bonuses to these people. To which the obvious answer is, if the financial crisis was brought about by the talent, let's have some mediocrity. So this second feature goes extremely deep, and I think both features are now so entrenched in our thinking that if we were to think that liberty and equality could be compatible and jointly implemented, we would have changed the meanings of liberty and equality from what we understand it from standard liberal thought. That is, if you thought that if it were per impossibile, jointly implemented, that liberty and equality were achieved together, it would be because we've changed the meanings of what liberty and equality means. Given what they mean in the last 300 years of theoretical developments, it is impossible to jointly realize these two ideals. For the reasons I gave, because of these two features and other features too, which I won't bother you with. So that's an issue which I think we should be thinking very hard about, and I don't believe. You see, when I say that you've got to change the meanings of the words, it's a little bit like there's a wonderful philosopher which some of you may have heard of called Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a great work called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He pointed out that the term mass does not mean the same in Newtonian mechanics, as it does in modern physics, in Einstein's physics. So relativistic mass and mass in Newtonian mechanics just mean different things. So these two theories, so it isn't as if Einstein's physics is an improvement on Newton's physics, because the meanings of the terms have changed. You use the same term, but the meanings are so different that the later theory is just not an improvement on the earlier theory, it's just a theory about a different thing. I mean, if one theory is an improvement on another theory, it's got to be about the same thing, but it's not about the same thing. I think any move to make liberty and equality compatible would just be giving up on the political enlightenment. Or so I claim. So, what I propose is just usher liberty and equality off center stage. If that means we are abandoning the great political enlightenment of the West, so be it. What we need is to put on center stage a third ideal, which is even more fundamental and important, even more basic, more primitive. And if you do value liberty and equality, as I do, then you should bring it in again from the back door, as it were, as merely necessary conditions for this third, more fundamental idea. So that's my frameworking proposal. That we find a third concept which is even more fundamental than the concepts which have fundamentally defined our thinking for the last 300 years. Put it on center stage instead of liberty and equality. Bring back liberty and equality as merely necessary conditions for this more important and fundamental goal or ideal. And so reconfigured, liberty and equality have a chance of actually being compatible with one another. But their meanings would have changed in the process of this paradigm shift, to put it in Kuhn's term, or reframeworking. So that's my proposal. So what is this third, more fundamental ideal? By fundamental, I don't mean it's an older ideal, I just mean that it is more basic to our most ordinary experience. So what is that ideal? And it's here that Marx and Gandhi share an ideal which is very deep for both of them, and that is the ideal of an unalienated life. The ideal of an unalienated life. So my proposal is that you make the ideal of an unalienated life central, and then see what role liberty and equality must play in order to achieve this goal. So the fundamental goal of politics, indeed of life, should be the achievement of the removal, the absence of alienation. And Marx and Gandhi are intellectual partners in this common cause. Marx studied alienation in great depth, both in his early work. It's often said that it doesn't feature much in his later work. That's false. It's all over his analysis of capital. And it is the basis of Gandhi's critique of modern Western civilization, of which his most central complaint was that in it there are central features, the nature of capital being one of them, which is the source of a mentality and a social life that is deeply alienated. And Gandhi, with desperate anxiety, did not want India to go down the path of embracing those institutions and ways of thinking. So my reading of Hind Swaraj is that in 1909, Gandhi wrote a book in which his implicit argument was that India was at the crossroads in 1909 that Europe was in the early modern period of the 17th century. And the developments in Europe from early modernity to late modernity, Gandhi found to be lamentable, capital being one of the aspects of, one of the most lamentable aspects of European society. Gandhi was extremely critical of capitalism, and mentioned it explicitly in detail. But he didn't have a socialist vision, he didn't have a notion of class or class struggle, but he was opposed to capitalism very explicitly and repeatedly. So his anxieties were that India would go down that path and embrace the alienations of that society, and that it was quite uncompulsory for India to do so. Now, in order to bring, now I'm going to, so I've given you a framework in which Gandhi and Marx, as I said, are after the same thing. And I don't want to talk that much about Marx immediately now, in the rest of the body of my talk until the end, because I really, Marx was very focused on Europe, and he was really analyzing advanced industrial societies of Europe, and Gandhi was writing about a society which was predominantly peasant society. By the way, if any of you have read this virtually nonsensical critique of Gandhi by Perry Anderson, which is everybody's reading, you will get a sense of how it is possible for somebody to be a Marxist and have absolutely no idea of what a peasant society is. So I'm going to talk about the kinds of alienation that Gandhi was anxious about. And I should remind you that India is still about 63% a peasant agrarian society. In case you're congratulating yourself on living in glamorous metropole. So let me then try and give you what Gandhi thought were the sources of alienation briefly, and then come back to the framework that I mentioned. Gandhi's conviction that we need, it was in Hind Swaraj when he placed the fault line of the kind of harms of Western alienated society, when he placed the fault line on the doorstep of modern science, he was quite misleading. He had nothing against science itself. He never said that the laws of science are false. What he was against was the elevation of science to a centrality in the outlook of people in a society in which it was exploited for profit-oriented wealth. That was his deep objection to science. Not to scientific laws, but to the centrality science can get in a culture which is frameworked within profit-oriented extractive wealth. And a question that he explicitly asked was, how and when did we transform the concept of the world as not merely a place to live in, but a place to master and control? That's a conceptual question and a genealogical question, because there's the question when. So how, by what agencies and when did we transform the world as not merely a place to live in, but a place to master and control? Now this is a very general question. It's impossible to answer it because it's of its generality. But I want to give you a very brief sense of what is meant by it. Let me move to some high philosophy in order to bring out what the question is asking. Some of you may know that for 200 years in the Western tradition of thought, there was a philosophical movement called skepticism. It's a movement which doubted that we have any knowledge of the world around us. And this is a recurring philosophical movement. The ancients had their skepticism, the medievals had their skepticism, and then in the 17th century, which was of great interest to Gandhi because that's when modern science emerged, Descartes raised skeptical questions as well about our knowledge of the world around us. But it's only in the 17th century that, with Descartes, that one inferred from one's doubt about our knowledge of the external world that there might not be an external world. nobody until Descartes came to that conclusion. The ancients doubted our knowledge of the external world. They never concluded from it that maybe, therefore, there is no external world. What's the difference? What was Descartes tapping that was just not taken for granted ever until Descartes? Because in the ancient world, people assumed that if you perhaps did not have knowledge of the external world, there were still other ways of relating to the world, i.e., merely living in the world. It's only with Descartes that one came to think that living in the world was so cognitively saturated that if you doubted your knowledge of the world, you doubted the world. That is, one's way of living in the world was so mediated by cognition or knowledge. That's the result of making science central. That the very idea of living in it came to be put into doubt if knowledge was put into doubt. That's a 17th century development. And that's what Gandhi was protesting. That you elevate intellectual knowledges to a centrality and thereby even make living in the world what philosophers much after Gandhi called logocentral. You make logos, knowledge, central in such a way that it dominates everything. And Gandhi's complaint was, well, what about merely living in the world? That's the alienation, that you keep seeing the world with intellectualized relations about it rather than living practically in an unalienated lifetime. So that's what the question was asking, but he then went on to break down the question in a scatter of writings by asking questions which echo in a more specific register the general question that I just put about the world. Questions such as, how did we transform the concept of nature into the concept of natural resources? How did we transform the concept of human beings into the concept of citizens? How did we transform the concept of people into the concept of populations? And finally, how did we transform the concept of knowledges to live by into expertise to rule by? These are all questions that Gandhi was pursuing, and they are, you will hear in them echoes of the more general question at a specific particular register, what knowledge, humanity, and so on. And let me just give you a sense of why he thought some of these things were the sources of alienation, some of these transformations. So take nature to natural resources, he said, was the result of a desacralization of nature. You removed God from being present in matter and nature and put him off in some providential external position, as Newton's mechanics did, because nature was brute and inert and motion came from an external push. And that was not just a theological shift as a result of Newtonian science. It was done with a view to removing obstacles for extractive taking from nature. If God did not suffuse matter and nature, you could take from nature with impunity. You did not have to show it the right forms of respect. You could see it as a source of agribusiness, as a source of just mining, all the rest of it that we know perfectly well. And he thought this was the desacralization of the earth was the beginning of the things that land us with our environmental problems today. That was his diagnosis of it. I've written about this, so I won't say much more about it, but the transformation of human beings into citizens is a very fascinating thing, and I want to say a little bit about that. You see, we think the transformation of human beings into citizens is a great thing, because it brings us rights, brings us constitutions, and it brings us codes of various kinds, and all these things are very good things. Gandhi wasn't opposed to these things, but he said we should understand their history and what they serve and have served. So he points out the rise of citizenship in Europe. How did citizenship arise in Europe? Citizenship arose in Europe because about the same time, as a result of the same developments that I've mentioned, state power could not be justified, could not be legitimated as it used to be. State power was legitimated in the past by the divine right of the monarch who personified it. That changed with Westphalia and with the developments around science, and you needed a new justification of state power. How was it to be done if it was not to be done by appeal to divine rights? Well, Gandhi points out, it was done all over Europe by a method in which it was basically a method of psychology, of political psychology. You legitimize state power by creating a feeling in the people for a new kind of entity which had emerged with the Westphalian peace, the nation, a feeling for the nation. And you defined the state as being indelibly linked to the nation. So you got this phrase, the nation-state. The dash is irremovable. And you justified the state by creating a feeling in the people for the left-hand side of the hyphenated conjunction, which is this new entity that came out of Westphalian peace, the nation. It was a psychology of justification, no longer a theology of justification. And this later on came to be called nationalism and so on. But at that time, it was just creating a feeling for one half of this hyphenated conjunction, the nation-state, thereby legitimating the other half. And all over Europe, this was done by a method that Gandhi pointed out must not happen in India. All over Europe it was done. How was this feeling created in the populace? It was done by finding an external enemy within the populace and despising it and subjugating it. The Jews, the Irish, Protestants in Catholic countries, Catholics in Protestant countries, and treating them as the other and claiming the nation as ours for the rest. This was a standard way of nation building. That's what citizenship was. That's the source of citizenship. And later on, with numerical and statistical forms of discourse in the social sciences, these came to be called majorities and minorities and so on. Majoritarianism. And that's what filled him with panic for India. So when he wrote with anxiety about what Savarkar was wanting, and Savarkar, remember, was, and this Ashish Nandi's written of this, Savarkar was basically a modern man. He was not a Hindu in any serious sense. He was a completely modern person, and he wanted a modern European state. What was a modern European state? Find an external enemy within and subjugate them. That's what it is to build a nation. That's what it is to develop and build and justify a state. A modern state. And when Gandhi was against the state, this is what he feared. So when he said it was an impertinence to think. You see, you've got to understand that it is the most basic commitment of the Enlightenment. The most basic commitment of the Enlightenment is something we actually have come to admire, but Gandhi did not admire it. The most central commitment of the Enlightenment is that what's bad in us can be constrained by good politics. Gandhi did not believe that. He just did not believe it. And he said it was an impertinence to think that you can make a human being better by making him over into some abstract thing called citizen. So, and this had all sorts of accompanying philosophical, theoretical accretions. So, for instance, this idea of citizenship, of codes and constitutions and rights and so on, has a very particular function in the thought that he was criticizing. He pointed out, actually the way to understand it, the way I've tried to understand it, is to first go back to a concept which comes just before rights and constitutions. I urge you all to read a fine book by Norbert Elias called The Civilizing Process, and that is the concept or the notion of civility. The notion of civility is a very important notion politically. Civility means all sorts of matters of dress and comportment and so on. But what was central to the idea of civility in public and political life was a semantics. It had nothing to do with empirical observation. It was stipulated meanings of semantics. The idea was that civility belonged as a property, a trait of, it was a trait that belonged to the monarch and his or her courts and the property elites around the monarch and his courts. They possessed civility. And there was the semantics around the term civility. So that's a definition. Civility is the sort of thing possessed by these people. Civility, by the same semantics, was contrasted with the notion of cruelty. Cruelty, by contrast, is a property of the brute populace. That's precisely what they lack is civility. What they possess is the contrast. The behaviors and lifestyles of the brute populace is cruel. And, as I said, this has nothing to do with observing their behavior. It's just got to do with how you define the terms and internalize them. And the idea, what effect this had, which is not something that Norbert Elias notices, the effect this has is that it hides from the monarch and his courts and the property elites the cruelty of their own perpetration on the brute populace, because they don't do cruelty. Right? So such cruelty as they perpetrate on the brute populace is hidden from them. Right? Because cruelty only happens among those people. Now, Gandhi's understanding of rights and codes and constitutions was, go ahead and admire them, but this is the function they've had all over the Western world. You have admired it, fine, but it has the same self-deceptive screening function. So countries which have codes and constitutions and rights are the countries in which there's no cruelty. Cruelty happens elsewhere. And so the cruelty that Western nations have perpetrated on distant lands is hidden from themselves, because we don't do cruelty in the West. So only Saddam's Iraq and Mugabe's Zimbabwe have cruelty, but it doesn't happen. There's no other way to understand Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay. Why aren't those prisons on American soil? Why not? Because Americans don't do torture. It must happen somewhere else. So you find some part of Mafia Cuba, Free Cuba, and the only part of Cuba which is, got the mafia. So Gandhi said, well, this is the history of citizenship, of rights. This is what its function is. Why am I supposed to admire it? It gave, and secular citizenship, he said, came with a view to solving these problems of subjugating minorities, religious minorities, etc. We have not got that problem, and so why should we be secular? That was his argument against it. So all these, he says, are ways of taking away from ordinary life, the ordinary life of Indian communitarian society, and making it abstract and detaching us into these intellectualized and alienated forms. Now, I want to move on to one other thing before coming to drawing some of these strands together. You see, one of the things that's very fascinating is that Gandhi had great commitments to communal life, to collective life. The ashram was just his most iconic way of living it, but he had an instinct which was there in many radicals of the past, such as the diggers and so on, which was that there is something remarkable about the cooperative living in the commons. The collective commons was a sort of romantic vision of his, which was much shared by radicals in the 17th century all over Europe, such as the diggers and levelers and so on. Now, what's interesting here is that Western thought has said that there is you must read, all of you should read a paper which is extremely important paper to understand the nature of political thought in the West. It's a paper which summarizes it. It's really there 2 or 3 centuries before the paper. It's a paper called The Tragedy of the Commons. And the Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom has done a lot of very interesting work on it. She died a year or so ago. Here's the idea of the tragedy of the commons. It's an argument against collective cultivation of the commons. It's an argument for privatization of the commons. The idea is this, and it's absolutely central to the thought that gives rise to what I was calling the incentivization of talent, and as well as property. Here's the idea of the tragedy of the commons. It can be very simply put. It's developed by social scientists, as social scientists always will, with a whole lot of mathematical modeling and all sorts of difficult frameworking. The idea is very simple, and it's perfectly easy to explain and understand. So do read this paper called Tragedy of the Commons by G.H. Haddon. The idea is this. It is not rational for individuals to cooperate, is the conclusion of the essay. And the reason is this. And it could be cooperation in any collective. So preserving the environment is a collective. So there's a sense in which the commons is fresh air. Fresh air is part of the commons. All of us share it, right? It's part of a commons that we all live in. It doesn't belong to anybody in particular. It's not privatized. It's a commonly available thing. So how to keep the air fresh is one concept of the commons, but cultivation of the commons of a peasantry in communal living, ashrams and so on, is another conception of the commons. Now, in the West, there grew a way of thinking in which it is said it is impossible to sustain the commons because it is not rational for individuals to cooperate in the commons. What is this kind of thinking? This is how it goes. It says, look, if you're going to have to cooperate to keep up the commons, you're going to have to make an individual contribution to it. So there is a cost to you to keep up the commons. And sometimes the cost is negative, so it may mean not polluting, right? Or it may mean, so if there's overfishing going on, it means to restrain yourself from fishing. Or if there's overcultivation of a commons going on, to restrain yourself from cultivation. So you have to make some sacrifice or contribution, whether it's negative or positive. And so you bear a cost as an individual. And the gains from the cost are distributed over everybody. It's divided, it's shared. So you each pay a cost, but the gains are shared by everybody. Now, what is absolutely true is that if everybody cooperated and paid their share and did their contribution, then everybody would gain. But there's an epistemic problem. No individual knows that the others are going to do it. You're in the epistemic dark about whether, if you do it, others will also do it. So, given that fact, why would you do it? Because if you didn't do it and didn't pay your cost, your gains would be immediate, right? Whereas if you paid the cost, the gains would be in the long run. And if you didn't pay the cost, your gains would be assured. Whereas if you did pay your cost, you're never sure that it's going to happen because others may not be cooperating. Right? So non-cooperation is both, the gains of non-cooperation are both immediate and assured. The gains of cooperation are long-term and they're not assured. It's not rational to cooperate. Privatization is inevitable and right. That's the basis of the right that I was talking about. And the same thinking goes into the incentivization of talent. I mean, I'm not going to spell it out, but it's obvious how it goes into. All right, so this is pervasive. It's called the multi-person prisoner's dilemma. There's a lot of fancy footwork around it. I've given you the basic idea. Everything else is modeling. Okay, so what is the solution to it? Now, even Noam Chomsky, whom I greatly admire, has said that all these ideologues have misunderstood the point of the tragedy of the commons. The point of that paper was not to establish privatization against cooperation. It was rather to say that we must police and regulate the commons so that free riding or this non-cooperation is blocked. That was the point of the paper. Well, I'm sorry to say that's a shallow response. Because there is no reason to, first of all, it's very hard to detect non-cooperation. So if you're going to police, if you're going to find mechanisms of policing and punishing non-cooperation, such as polluting in the case of fresh air, it's very hard to first of all catch the culprit. Right? I mean, you can catch corporations. You can't do much about it. But by and large, it's very hard to detect non-cooperation. So that's a problem. But even if that was overcome, it's a shallow response because this dilemma of this way of thinking can arise one step up. Why should people cooperate with policing and punishing? Why? I mean, if I can get away by bribing somebody, by the way, this is rampant here, so you should be able to, and in many parts of the world, so you should be able to understand what I'm saying. But if I can bribe somebody or threaten somebody with mafia-style threats, I can get out of the cooperation in policing and punishing. It happens all the time. So it's not as if you've solved the problem of this way of thinking by suggesting that there should be regulation and policing and punishment. The problem arises one step up for policing and punishment. You can say, I don't want to cooperate with it if I can bribe and get away with it, or threaten people and get away with it, etc. So you have to dig much deeper to get out of all of these problems. And that's where I think that both Gandhi, in talking of the unalienated life, and Marx, when they talked of certain solidarities and the outlooks of of cooperation and so on in communal living, they were opposed to the very thinking that goes into it. And how much time do you have? Do you have about 5 or 10 minutes before I can? Yeah, okay, good. So let me sum up what it is that Marx had in mind by the solidarities of an unalienated life, and Gandhi in this ideal of the ashram community. What was deep about this was not just ashram life and all, which is fine, but the thinking that goes behind it, which I think is profound. You see, what I've been doing is saying that the concept of an unalienated life is a concept that began to be threatened with modern society. That's both Gandhi and Marx described it. Marx in the case of capital, Gandhi through the elevation of science into an outlook of society and so on. So, but everybody agrees, both of them agree, and almost all political theorists agree, that however defective society was before modernity, it never had alienation. It was bad in all sorts of other ways, but it didn't have alienation. People had a sense of belonging, and whatever else they suffered from, they were not alienated. Alienation is a modern phenomenon. This is universally agreed. Now, if that is so, well, what were the defects that accompanied unalienated lives earlier on? Well, precisely the lack of liberty and equality. So, if, as I'm arguing, you need to bring in liberty and equality as necessary conditions for the unalienated life, I'm going to have to transform the concept of an unalienated life too, from what was pre-modern notions of unalienated life. So, my intellectual project here is extremely ambitious, because what I'm trying to do, I mean, I may not disagree, but what I'm trying to do in invoking Gandhi and Marx here as a pair is a triangular transformation of three concepts. I've said that liberty and equality as concepts have to have their meanings transformed if they're going to be jointly implemented. But I'm now saying that the concept that I put on center stage, unalienated life, has also got to be transformed, because it can't be the pre-modern one, because that precisely lacked liberty and equality, and I want liberty and equality to be necessary conditions for it. So I'm going to have to transform all three concepts in concert together. Right? That's the idea. And how is one to do that? And it's here, I think, that you have to appeal to some of the things that Gandhi and Marx both talked of when they talked of solidarities. Let me give you a sense of it. You see, if you analyze what goes wrong with the incentivization of talent and property through this argument from tragedy of the commons that I've been talking about, what's going on is that liberty, individual liberty, is conceived of in terms that are brazenly individualistic. So you need something paradoxical. You need the idea of individual liberty to be conceived non-individualistically. That's the point of the ashram ideal and Marx's notion of the solidarities of labor. This is paradoxical, but just follow my dialectic for a moment. You see, alienation, when you talk about alienation, the individual is central. I'm not interested in collectivization and all that. You can't, I don't believe you can have a humane politics unless the individual is central. That's just a given, I think, unless you want some kind of Stalinist ideal and so on, basically you have to place the individual as central. Because to feel unalienated, or indeed alienated, is a feeling that individuals have. So the individuals are central willy-nilly. So what you've got to ask is, what is it for an individual to have liberty but configured non-individualistically? how is individual liberty to be conceived non-individualistically? That's the intellectual target here. And I think that the right way to think of it is to think of how we perceive the normative demands that are made, the value demands that come from the world around us, nature, society, and so on, is that when we look at the world and see the demands it makes on us, the normative demands, we ought to see it not from the point of view of our own self-interest, but from the point of view of everyone's self-interest. But look, I've said something completely banal. The critique of self-interest is widely known, and it's very familiar. But I'm not just making a critique of self-interest. What I'm proposing is that this way of thinking is a way of thinking of liberty. That's, if there's novelty here, that's the novelty. That is, individual liberty must take a standpoint on the world as one perceives its demands, not from one's own interests, but from the point of view of more general interests. Let me give you an example. I was teaching my daughter to drive a car. And so I was sitting in the driver's seat and explaining various things to her, and she was sitting by my side. And, I noticed, I'm going to come out and do this. So I'm driving the car, and, better get to the mic. I was driving the car, and she's sitting next to me, and so I would look at her, and my orientation, my bodily orientation, was from the individual body looking at her. I would then turn around, so I would talk to her, say, this is the clutch, and then I would turn around and I would look at the road with a view to driving the car. And my orientation on the world was now not from the point of view of my individual body, but from the point of view of the car. I mean, this is not something I had realized until I was actually teaching my daughter how to drive a car. That is, one has, so this is a bodily way of thinking. So when I talk to you, my orientation towards you is my body towards you. But when I'm driving, my orientation to the world is not from the point of view of my body. If I looked at it from the point of view of my body, I'd crash the car, right? I have to look at the world from the point of view of something larger than me, from the point of view of the car, right? Otherwise, I'm sure to crash the car. And that's what I'm suggesting. We need a social extrapolation of that analogy. Right? We have to see the demands of the world, not from our individual point of view, but from the point of view. And if that happens, then you can't even ask, if you have the social version of my bodily analogy, you can't even ask the question. You can't even ask the question, what if others didn't do what I paid the cost of the commons and so on? You couldn't even ask that question. Right? So it's your liberty. Your liberty would have, the deliverances of your liberty would be compatible with the equality of your liberty. Right? But you have to have this orientation, which is exactly, so the way to think of the commoner in the tragedy of the commons who says, well, what if somebody doesn't do it, and is to say, you're already alienated. To ask that question, you're alienated. I've written in an early piece of mine on Gandhi of an episode with my father. I used to occasionally go on walks with him in part of Bombay called Cuff Parade when I was a kid. And so one day, so some of you have read this. One day we came across a wallet. My father said, well, why shouldn't we take this? And I said, I think we should take it. And it was a wallet with some rupees. And he said, why should we take it? I said, because if we don't take it, somebody else will take it. So let's take it. And I thought he might get cross or something, but he said, I thought completely without logic, but magnificently, he said, so I said, if we don't take it, somebody else will take it. And he said, if we don't take it, nobody else will take it. Well, I had no idea what he was saying, but what he was suggesting was that if you're unalienated, you just take it for granted. If you're living in an alienated society, you just take it for granted that you don't ask the question of the commoner and the tragedy of the commons. The question is the question of an alienated person. What if somebody else doesn't do it, and so on? So I think both Marx and Gandhi quite strictly had the idea of this solidarity of the unalienated life, and you just need a social extrapolation from the bodily analogy I gave about the car and the individual body. And if that is right, then this whole way of thinking, including the tragedy of the commons, the tragedy of the commons is basically the tragedy of the car crash. Thank you very much.